doing DeFi, greatest in the world, and they finally about to see why. What you know about XRD? I'm smart money, I ain't never on a decline. What you know about NFTs? It's not just Ace, when you finally gonna realize you need scalability, need more utility, then you better call on these guys. I'm going radical, I'm going Radix, I'm going radical, I'm going Radix. Hyperspeed DeFi, never on a decline, building the future, I feel like a savage.
Hello and welcome. I am Piers Ridyard, CEO of RDX Works, a core developer of the decentralized finance protocol, Radix, a public ledger entirely focused on bringing DeFi into the mainstream. This is our podcast, The DeFi Download, a show about decentralized finance and all things crypto, where we dive into the details of the projects, assets, and services that are powering the DeFi revolution. Today, I'm joined by Tim Boss, founder and CEO of ShareRing. ShareRing is a digital identity blockchain system with features that enable you to utilize your digital ID in the real world. Tim, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Piers.
Very welcome. So, let's start with I think for this one, there's some interesting sort of like threads to pull in around crypto versus centralization, right? Like a lot of people like the decentralization maximalists, pseudonymity as the default. So before we dive into that, let's just go into a bit more of like, what does ShareRing actually do? So what from a user perspective, what am I doing with ShareRing?
Yeah, so we started the company in around 2017. We established the actual company in 2018. Our original goal with ShareRing was really to create a foundation to make it easier and more frictionless to rent goods and services. So it was really focused on the sharing economy. And as we sort of went through the process of building our own blockchain on using Cosmos or Tendermint at the time, and so on, we started sort of digging deeper into the whole aspect of identity and self-sovereign identity, and then a lot further down the track, verifiable credentials. And one thing became very, very obvious to us is that the sharing economy wasn't just a problem that we could solve with verifiable credentials. It was a lot bigger than that. So the things that we were developing could be used across the finance industry, the rental industry, travel industry, events industry, you name it. So we've got this belief that when we apply for something or use our identity to apply for something, we shouldn't have to give the company that we're applying to every bit of information about us and all of the history about us. What we should be able to do is just give them the minimum amount of information required for them to believe who we are and trust who we are. And if sort of company A says, yes, this is that person, then company B should know that company A has already done that verification and they should be able to trust you. So the technology that we developed using blockchain technology, self-sovereign ID and verifiable credentials allows us to achieve that. So our overall mission is all about reducing friction for purchasing, renting, buying goods and services for anything across a lot of industries. And we are targeting on a small number of industries at the moment, mainly events, using credentials and NFT ticketing, finance industry for eKYC, and then also promoting the building of smart contracts on our blockchain around verifiable credentials.
Okay, so let's break those up a little bit and sort of go into the use case of each one. So events, what is the user experience of a sharing identity in events, and like how does that make the user experience sort of better?
Sure. So starting with the problems that we solve, I think there's no secret that ticketing today is quite flawed. I know plenty of people that have gone on Gumtree or Craigslist and tried to buy tickets off somebody because they're desperate to get tickets to a concert or a sporting event. They've sent $200 and received nothing back, or received fake tickets, or somebody's gone outside a game at a stadium in LA and bought from someone selling out the front with a piece of paper, and just they go in and it's fake. So I think NFT ticketing can solve a lot of those problems, so it does remove a lot of fraud. But one aspect of it is identity and ticketing do go hand in hand. So when you issue a ticket, to attach that to an identity, to be able to prove something about yourself, to be able to enter that venue is a big thing. Right now, what happens is if I go to an event that requires me to be over 18 or over 21, I need to pull out my driver's license, show the ticket. Someone looks at my driver's license, they see my full name, my home address, my age, my birth date, all of that information. Whereas what they really need to know is that I'm the right age to be able to go in, and that ticket is attached to my identity. So we see a lot of NFT ticketing companies coming up, and they're just focusing on, let's prove that I have this NFT to be able to enter this event. But what we're finding by working with a number of event companies is that identities should go hand in hand with that. So using verifiable credentials and zero knowledge proof, the event holder can trust that when through our app or smart contracts, when they can trust that when that person says that they're over 18, that they are over 18 and they can enter that event. Mm-hmm. And when they say that that's my ticket, then they can go in. And one of the things problems that we recently solved as well is with a lot of NFT ticketing, they're requiring a whole lot of new infrastructure for somebody to prove that they own that NFT, like signing a transaction and all that. But what we've made is, so within our app, you can connect your NFTs, and we generate a QR code that you can use with legacy ticketing systems. So you can basically just go in, scan the QR code. That QR code allows you to prove that you're of age, or that is your identity. It can prove that you own that NFT and let you in sub 1 second.
So it's sort of like a melding of the two technology worlds. What already exists for event-based ticketing, and then adding in a layer of like confirmation. So like, how big a problem is that for the events industry? The making sure that you don't let in anyone under 18, or like the identity is actually the person who you think it is. Is that something that is sort of a mild irritant but is already solved by door staff, or is something that's actually an endemic problem?
There's a few ways to look at this. So one is, it's a big PR problem for the events organisers, because you do often see reports of people not being able to get in for various reasons and things like that. It's also a problem for the door staff, because you effectively create a bottleneck with the requirement to check this extra ID and all of that. It's also a problem for the customers who are going. They don't want to hand over their ID to some complete stranger to look at that information. So it is not necessarily one big problem that's endemic. It's a number of smaller problems that are growing and boiling. And, you'll see things on the news about one other problem that's solved by this. So, our view is it solves a lot of the little ones, and it's not necessarily us talking to just the event companies. It could be the ticketing companies. It could be the organisers. It could be the people that are the security and things like that. So we look at this from all angles, and we've learnt a lot through a number of pilots that we've done, trials and things like that, from the smallest events, like a small event at a restaurant that we did, to one with the rugby in Hong Kong last year as well. There's been a huge amount that we've learned through that process.
Yeah, I was going to say, I can see sort of like some separate issues that would emerge as soon as you have like ticketing gated on identity, because then you still have to have the person provide their identity to the clearing service, to the sharing service, and a lot of people are not that organized. So doing it in the queue, I would imagine a lot of the time, when they're like, oh, I need to download my ticket. Oh, I can't download my ticket until I've done this extra verification step. And that's a different type of friction. It's a friction rather than at the door staff. It's a friction from the user perspective. So how did you get around things like that?
We made the process fast. So we did have that problem when we were doing one of the trials, and people had to stand there and download the app. So they downloaded the app. It only takes a couple of minutes to sign up. So they scan the ID, we do OCR, we do some AI, we do a facial sort of movement recognition and all that stuff. If it's a passport, they can just hold the passport to the phone and it'll read the NFC chip on it, which creates a higher level of verification. So it is very, very fast in that process. The other challenge that we have in events is cellular service is often terrible, really, really bad. So there does sometimes obviously have to be a backup. But when we generate, if you've got the app downloaded, to generate the QR code and actually let you in requires no mobile service at all. So you could put your phone in flight mode from when you turn up to the event, and the QR code will still display, it will still show, and you can still scan yourself in. Because it's only when you get this stuff out in the real world and test it that you notice some of these sorts of gaps. And I think that we'll still find more as we go to larger and larger events, but that's just all part of the process. That's part of putting out some new disruptive technology.
I mean, that all of that so far doesn't sound like it necessarily needs blockchain to do. That sounds like, everything that's described so far you could do just as a standard service.
Yes and no. So where the blockchain solves this is there's no centralized repository of that information about that user, right? So we, at ShareRing, we don't know. The only thing we know about you is your name and email address. That's it. So when you sign up and you do your driver's license and all of that, what we do is when you scan it, so you've got the app on your phone, you sign up, you scan all that information, the app will basically check that information. We've got some AI built that basically does the facial and the movement and all that. And then what it does is it does a digital hash of the document into a small sort of number of characters. That digital hash is then stored on the blockchain. So you still have 100% complete control of your identity, and it's stored in something we call the vault. And you can store multiple forms of ID. You could store your vaccine certificate if you have one. You could store university certificates, all sorts of stuff in the vault. And it's encrypted with your public key in the vault, so only you have access to it. But everything in terms of the verifiable documents is hashed, and that hash is stored on the blockchain. So if I then go into that file and I change the photo, if I change one pixel or one letter of information, that information is no longer valid, right? So you can no longer confirm with the immutable data that's on the blockchain that that information is actually valid. So now when I sort of check into something like an event or something, they know that I haven't faked the information that's going into that. And that's very, very powerful, because what it means is we don't have a problem with GDPR. We don't have a problem with things like State Records Act, where we may be storing information about a citizen that's not within our country or something like that. So it's a truly global solution. And what we can also do through that is only send the minimum amount of information required to prove something about yourself to be able to access this service or this event or something like that. Mm-hmm. And you can't do that without blockchain. Blockchain is a very important part of that. And then going beyond that, the things that you can then do with that verifiable identity is build things like connect it with soulbound tokens, so that using a bit of information, you can access, say, DeFi contracts and things like that. You can there's a lot that you can basically do in terms of the workflow using that verifiable credential.
Right. Okay. And so then the second thing you mentioned was eKYC
Yes.
for sort of financial companies. So that's sort of pushing a bit more into the regulated sphere. So how does that work?
So we're having a lot of fun with this. So basically, one of the things that we're working with some financial institutions at the moment on is this idea of how do they have a positive identification of a person without creating the bottlenecks and the staffing and all that that's required for verifying that person. So right now, to sign up for, say, a credit union or a bank, you generally in a lot of countries need to go in there and physically show identity, right? You physically show information, all that sort of stuff. Or somebody needs to be in that process. You can't just automate it like crypto exchanges do. It's just regulation just generally doesn't allow you to do that. There are some in terms of virtual banks that allow you, but for the majority that don't. So basically what we do is we allow you to sort of use your verifiable credentials, add things like proof of address, proof of email, phone number, that sort of stuff. And then that gets packaged up and then encrypted with, say, the financial institution's public key. They receive that information, they can do a manual check on it. What then happens is they effectively issue a certificate back to you that goes into your ShareRing Vault that says, I, Bank XYZ, have checked this identity and we verify that that is correct. What that then does is for that user in their self-sovereign identity, it actually increases the power of their identity. So it means that they've got a stronger identity because it's been checked by financial institution A. So any other companies, whether or not they're car sharing companies, loan providers, other banks and stuff like that trusts that institution, they can then automatically accept you as a client when you try to sign up with them without having to go through that eKYC process.
Yes,
as part of that.
But only non-regulated entities at that point, right?
So we're actually working with some regulated entities to go through that process of creating effectively a bubble of trust between those entities.
Right. So like the concept of reliance, because in most jurisdictions, a financial institution has to have the original copies of the KYC AML information. And
That's correct. Yes.
And has to do their own checks. So, if Bank A says, "Oh, I verified this person," that doesn't mean that Bank B can rely on it instantly. There's a bunch of extra things such as they would need to have the underlying documentation. They would have to have verified that the process that the KYC AML has gone through is good. They'd have to do spot checks every now and then to audit the process.
Yeah.
So
and some of them are increasing the spot checks to every 3 months as well. So
right.
There are a lot of jurisdictional requirements, but through the process that we've done, it's flexible enough to allow for like an all or nothing approach. So if a spot check's required on just AML, they can do that if they try, and then they can trust through the alliance some of those other financial institutions. And the thing through this is jurisdictional requirements are very different in a lot of different places. Like EU, for example, are introducing some new digital identity requirements as well, which is another level. Australia's got the TDIF, the Trusted Digital Identity Framework. So there's a number of sort of things around that. The other aspect to that as well, though, is that through that bank actually verifying, or even if it's any other type of financial institution, it could be an exchange or something like that, they can effectively issue a type of soulbound token. And I'm not talking in the traditional sense in terms of the big white paper that has a governance committee that sits in terms of approving the information, but effectively a type of soulbound token that's attached to your account. And by virtue of you owning that, then that would allow you to effectively access regulated DeFi smart contracts as well, just by virtue of you actually owning that. So you can do effectively a traditional KYC AML that then gives you access to these DeFi smart contracts as well.
Well, I mean, that will solve 50% of the problem, right? Because you'll do the KYC AML, or the identity-based KYC, the identity-based AML, so PEPs and sanctions, but you will not have anti-money laundering from the point of view of source of wealth, source of funds.
Yeah, exactly.
So it would let you access DeFi up until the point, or to the point that you've proven yourself not to be a politically connected person or someone who has sanctions against you. You've proven yourself to be a real person, but you haven't actually completed the regulatory requirements for putting money into a financial marketplace, which includes the sort of the source of wealth, source of funds point. Are you planning something on that side as well?
Yeah, so we've got a workshop coming up in London. We're just planning at the moment in November, where we're basically, that's one of the subjects that we're talking to. So our sales team and one of our technical account managers and part of our technical team were working or doing a number of workshops with some of our financial institutions that we're talking to about exactly that. And now we're sort of moving to the next level of basically putting a lot of that stuff together. So yeah.
So how does the data sharing work between institutions? So like if Bank A checks me and then Bank B, then I want to use my credentials with Bank B. Does Bank A then send my information to Bank B?
It's an interesting question. So it's that discussion's come up, and the preference is that we're basically seeing pretty much all around is that I would still be sending my information to Bank B, but Bank B won't need to go through that rigorous process because they trust that Bank A has already basically done that. So what they're saying is, through a pilot we ran a while ago, they actually managed to reduce the headcount around their KYC people in terms of the overheads required to check that information. So we are seeing a positive effect out of that already, because data sharing between banks, that's even if they're part of an alliance, it's a very, very difficult thing to do, but it's also a very, very difficult thing to police. As part of that, you just don't want to open that, because part of one of our values is really around you control your identity. And if you're controlling your identity, yet these banks are sharing your data, that sort of defeats the purpose a little bit, doesn't it?
Right, but from a regulator, like until regulations change, the banks actually do need to keep a copy of everything. I think there's that's sort of like one of the things that seems to constantly be the battle for this concept of sovereign identity versus not sovereign identity is under most jurisdictions regulations, the regulated entity has to have the original copies of everything. And so, even though you can make it simpler from the front end in terms of I get I seem to control my identity. Actually, every single institution I interact with still needs a copy of everything. So there's still multiple copies of my identity being sort of going around.
Yes, they need a copy. They need a copy of certain parts of your identity. Correct. Yes.
Yeah. So like they'll need the original copy of your passport, or the original copy of your driving license, or the original copy of your proof of address, right? Which is basically.
And we're not. I mean, we would love to say financial institutions, you've just got to trust that this is my name and my phone number and my address.
Yeah.
Because Bank A has already said that. But they still, even though they can trust it without actually doing the extra test, because they trust that this other company has done it through the mechanism we've put in place, they still do have to keep copies of it. But then you go down the chain, though, and this is where you sort of start getting some of that real value out of it. When you go down the chain to some other services that actually rely more on the trust aspect. So things like car sharing companies, they don't have to keep all of that information. So if you can give them the minimum amount of trusted information, because I mean, I don't want to give a car sharing company my passport with my passport number and my driver's license and all that. I don't want to give that to Uber just so I can get a car somewhere or something like that. Like, this is where you start to really see that value. So you provide the service at that top level, and then you start to sort of see that flow down value through that service that you provided at that top level.
Right.
So
things like the Uber hack wouldn't be as damaging.
Yeah. It's still. I mean, I'm not. You can't use a service without giving any information, because you can't sort of say to a car sharing company, "Hey, I'm Tim Boss. Can I borrow your car?" And they go, "Oh yeah, that bank says that you're Tim Boss." They still need to keep my name and my phone number and my address in case I don't come back with that car. But they don't need my driver's license number and my passport and my this and this and this because of that trusted angle. So yeah, it's less damaging, and you're also providing less attack vectors for those services as well, and for you.
Yes, and from the point of view of the attack vector in your system, each phone, it has the vault which has the information in.
And that's encrypted with your public key. So it requires your private key to unlock. We store the private key in the application-specific key store, and then the only way you can access that is through your biometric to be able to actually access it. And any time information within the vault is accessed, you need biometrics to be able to actually access it. So even if someone stole your phone, the information is completely useless, and unless you've got my face match or thumbprint or something like that. We do also allow you to back up the vault as a file to your cloud or Google Drive or something like that. But once again, that's a single file that's encrypted with your public key. So if someone gets your public key, which is really you only look at it and view it when you first set up the account, that's the only way for them to get that access to those details.
Got it. Okay. And in terms of like sort of things like PEPs and sanctions, do you guys do those checks as well?
We can if we're asked to. So it's not by default. Like when you sign up, we're not going to do any of that. But if you try to access, say, a financial service that requires that, and that financial service doesn't want to do it yourself, we can put that in between the services part of that.
Okay. Because I just was thinking of like sort of enhanced due diligence you might want on a driver, for example, of an Uber. You want their identity, but you also want adverse media, potentially criminal background checks, those kind of things. Which is
exactly. And one of the benefits behind this is if you compare it to sort of services like Onfido and things like that, and it's hard to compare what we do to that type of service, but people do try to draw a line between the two. If I basically apply for a car sharing company something else, like 10 different things that require my identity. All 10 of those will query on Fido, may query on Fido, and they'll all pay £2, £3 or something like that to do that query. So all of them have actually queried on Fido. On Fido goes off and freshly checks all of that information, and they've effectively spent between all of them £30 to check it. Whereas we can actually do this check once. You've got verified information, then you can use it across all 10 of those companies. So you get far greater scale of that there, because the information and the checks actually stay here instead of on these separate APIs.
Interesting. And so, like, from the point of view of verifiable credentials, it sounds like a lot of your work is based on sort of the sovereign Evernin W3C work on sort of digital identifiers and DIDs. What are they? Decentralized ID, right?
Decentralized, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So is it? Go on.
Yeah, all of the information, basically, the metadata and all that sort of stuff is structured according to W3C standards as well. So we do follow those standards as part of it. It's, it doesn't make sense to create new ones when W3C is extremely scalable in terms of the types of identity and the metadata that you can store with that. So, and it also means, for us, if we need to present information in their standard or through ID 2020 or something like that, then it allows us to very, very easily present it in whatever those trusted standards are as well.
Yeah. Have you found yourselves like having to build how much of the framework for how you store the identity information? Because I know the W3C standards, at least last time I looked at them, were quite broad. They're quite specific in terms of how you create the verifiable credentials, but quite broad as into what format those verifiable credentials actually are.
Yeah, that was a huge amount of work for us. So there's a few challenges involved with that, because basically when we hash the data, the information from the documents, what we also do is we do a watermark on that document. So we'll watermark, say, the digital hash on it. And then also when I send, say, a document to you, we'll watermark the destination. So we'll watermark your information on that document so that if you're hacked and that leaks for some reason, we can always trace it back to you. So what we needed to do through the vault that we created, we did a lot of R&D to try to make sure we can maximize the efficiency, the flexibility, minimize the size, and all that sort of stuff. So we went through and we ended up using like a Merkle tree type structure to basically store the tree of information about the documents that are stored to maximize the scale and what you can do with those documents. So I would say just that process itself was 6 months, easily 6 months through a lot of trial and error, because you're right, W3C is a framework, and that's all it is. It's a framework. It doesn't tell you how to implement things because there's so many ways to do it, and I don't think that they wanted to get to that level. And then it's not future-proof. Like what they've done is kind of future-proof.
Right.
And if you start sort of talking about that level of technology, it's not future-proof.
Right, which sort of means that there's going to be a bunch of emerging standards, right? That sort of like all implement this in a slightly different way.
When is there not a bunch of emerging standards?
When the EU comes in and says, no, there will be one standard for a USB-C plug.
Yeah, let's love that. The Apple. Yeah, I mean, let's stifle innovation, shall we? I think one of the beauties of this as well, though, is we looked at that and said, well, instead of us trying to dictate the standards to everyone that we send this information to, let's make it so that we can create a product that's flexible enough to send it in your standard. So we're not dictating to you how you accept this information. What we say to you is, do you have an API already? How are you set up to do it? And all that sort of stuff. And if you don't, then we'll say, okay, this is how you should receive it. But if you do, we'll say, okay, let's use that. So we can take this information and translate it on the fly to give it to you in the way that you need it.
So definitely more of a technical lift for you guys to integrate all of the standards, but I can see why that would be there.
It is. It's definitely an effort. I mean, and that's one part of our business where we focus on business to business relationships and building that area there. So, to be honest with you, it's easier to change the way we send stuff to an API or however it's done, then trying to sort of work and send people out to get a bank or something like that to implement our standard in their bank. I mean, it's much easier the way that we're approaching it, even though it's more development effort, but much less consultative effort.
Yeah. So I suppose from a philosophical standpoint, like, doesn't this all go against the sort of the ideals of public ledgers and full pseudonymity and this ability to sort of transact without having to identify yourself, and like, why is actual identity necessary when you can just have things like soulbound tokens and reputation and things like that don't actually have to link back to a real world identity?
Yeah, listen, I completely understand and accept that, and I think unashamedly we do go against the grain a bit in that sense, and that's because when we first started ShareRing, we said let's look at solving real world problems as they are now, in terms of looking at how we can use this great new technology to solve some of the problems and make things a bit better and a bit safer for the users and add more trust in that process. So whilst we're not going all the way there to allow for complete anonymity, I think some of the services that we're offering, like with the soulbound tokens that I gave an example of before, you can basically create complete anonymity whilst interacting with a semi-regulated DeFi product. Say maybe that DeFi contract says you cannot be a US citizen or from somewhere else in the world, and you can have a soulbound token that through this process you've proven that you're not from the US or you're not a US citizen or a resident, and you can interact with that DeFi product. So you still respect that complete anonymity, but at least that DeFi product knows that they're not going to fall foul of the SEC by virtue of its existence.
Mm-hmm. And so this soulbound token, is the soulbound token give you a pointer to an on-ledger zero knowledge proof about that person, or is each soulbound token a different one issue depending on what it is that you want to prove? It's like, say, non-US citizen.
Yeah. Effectively it'll be one issue. Like, it's based on whatever that individual thing that you're trying to prove is.
Right.
So the issuer of that soulbound token is key to the existence of that soulbound token.
And who is the issuer?
So we're not sort of saying let's issue a bunch of them. It depends. So the structure that we're basically putting together is if we're the issuer, if you basically choose to create the soulbound token, then and issue that through that mechanism. Some people may accept that or not. We haven't sort of published anything around this. So, but then you may have some of these financial institutions could be the issuer of that soulbound token. So the trust is more in the issuer of the token than the information that's in that token itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we actually follow that with part of our verifiable credentials. We've got 3 types of verifiable credentials. We've got what we call verified at source. So that's a credential that is verified at source. Like, it could be a university creating a graduation certificate, and that would go straight into your vault. So there's no middleman between the university and your vault. So that's verified at source, at the source of the creation. The ShareRing verified, which is things like some identity documents, the NFC on the passport and those things. And then there's another one which is verified by self, which has got the lowest level of trust, but it's information that you need to put in there to tell someone something about yourself that you want to have stored in there that may be time-stamped.
And how
a will or something like that.
Okay, and so the how do you guys sort of what is your main strategy for sort of like growth of, because this kind of business is very much a business that succeeds on network effects and sort of like adoption of standards, which is a difficult business to get into. Obviously, we're really early in an industry, so these kind of things are great, like businesses to start. So what's your approach to growing this in a way that will get you the sort of the critical mass that's necessary?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So we've basically got 2 sides to the business. One is what we've mostly been talking about, which is the B2B, business to business side of things. So we rely on strong partnerships and adoption from within those businesses to get the clients. So we're not sort of advertising to the end users to say, use this. It's up to the businesses, and we rely very, very heavily on those. So that's one aspect. And for us, we see that as, I wouldn't say a slow burner. We've got some pretty good, like solid forecasts in place for that, but it's not going to give us 1 million transactions a day tomorrow, right? So it is something that has a ramp-up effect, and we need to run through pilots. Events has, I would say, probably 20 times more transaction volume than eKYC, just because of the things like the transfer and the sale of the NFTs and all that sort of stuff. But what we're basically doing as a company is we're really sort of focusing on a couple of things at the moment. One is, as I said, eKYC and the events using verifiable credentials. On the other side, though, and this is where we're sort of looking for more critical mass and faster scale, it's really about over the next few weeks, we're actually opening up ShareLedger. We're deploying the smart contracts engine tomorrow. We're opening up ShareLedger. We're opening up the APIs and client libraries and all of that sort of stuff. And then we're creating programs and incubators to allow people to start building on the ShareLedger platform. So it's really incentivizing people to start building on that using the verifiable credentials. One of the benefits we've got is, as part of the Cosmos ecosystem, using things like interplanetary blockchain, we can actually start marketing it as really the verifiable credentials blockchain, soulbound tokens, NFTs, that the other chains within the Cosmos ecosystem can also leverage as well. So the first step of that is we're currently getting everything ready to start running some hackathons as well. And then my sort of background and history as mentors with some of the other incubators like Techstars and things like that, we'll start leveraging some of that as well to start building on that ecosystem. So it's not something that happens overnight, but we're quite confident that we've got something like enough in place now to really start driving those transactions.
Interesting. I suppose it's quite a simple thing to bring multi-chain as well, just from the point of view of
for sure,
if you
100%.
want,
Even the soulbound tokens you can basically make multi-chain.
Right.
Even the NFT event stuff, we've already made that multi-chain. You can go in the app and connect a ShareLedger derived verifiable credential and connect that with an ERC20 NFT to basically create a QR code and get into an event. Right. So it's something we've always looked at and said, well, the reason why we built our own ledger at the time was there's a number of reasons, but part of it is on the B2B side, you need to have a predictable pricing model in terms of transaction pricing. So we've created a module called Gentlemint that actually translates a USD transaction fee to, I didn't name it. I don't know who named it, but I love it. But basically what it does is it translates a US dollar transaction fee, say 5 cents per transaction, and it's got an exchange module that basically regularly looks up what the price of share token is, and it will translate that, let's say share tokens, say 1 cent or something like that. It'll buy 5 share tokens for the masternode holders and distribute that amongst them. So it means that the business-to-business side always has a predictable transaction model, whereas it actually drives scarcity of the token through that sort of by buying tokens based on the US dollar. And then on the other side, it just uses, with the smart contracts engine, just uses standard gas model. And we have a community pool which is going towards the funding for the hackathons and incubators and things like that.
And so what is the business model of sharing? How do you guys make money? How do you guys continue to develop?
Yeah, so most of the focus at the moment is now starting to drive the transactions. So our revenue really comes from, we own some of the masternodes. So we'll make revenue off the masternodes, and then we will also, on the business-to-business side, we also receive some of the transaction fees that come through to that. And then we'll have maybe there's a hosting service that will charge SaaS fees and things like that. But what we wanted to do from the start is really align the interests of the company with the interests of our token holders as well, and try to make sure that our focus is around maximizing those transactions, because then all of our interests are aligned. What helps us build the community.
What is a transaction? So what is a transaction on your ledger? Like, what's an example of a transaction on the ledger?
Anything that a mutating sort of transaction. So anything that creates something. So a transaction on the business using Gentleman could be a create ID, it could be a verified document, it could be a create a digital hash. On the gas side, it's all part of a smart contracts engine, so it's just gas. That's what transactions are, is gas transactions. But on the business to business, it's really just any mutating type transaction. So things like a lookup of information of checking of the hash, that's not a transaction. That's free because it's an open permission chain. Whereas things that are mutating based transactions are really where we've got that. We've got a fee table of the different types of transactions. So it ranges from 1 cent for transferring some tokens or something up to, I think, 5 cents for creating an ID.
Okay. And so there is a cost to the user to create their identity on ShareRing?
No cost. So we fund that. When you first create the identity, we fund that. Okay. So that's a loss for us. Yeah. Okay. So what we created this with keeping in mind that it's the idea is the end consumer of the information would effectively be wearing the majority of the fees for it, because they're the ones that derive the most value from that experience. So we remove all of the barriers for the user.
Mm-hmm. And from the point of view of its last question is fascinating. Last question is how do you know, or how do the businesses know that how you check the documents is good, like, and is able to withstand fraud? Like, there are, Jumio and OnFido and all of these big companies, multi-billion-dollar companies that have built these technology stacks to make sure that they can check passports or check IDs, and that's a constantly, changing universe of possibilities, and things go out of date, things come in, ID types change, all this kind of stuff. How is yours? Because you said your algorithm's running on the phone, right?
Yeah, so we do send some data off phone. It's never at rest. It's always in transit. So some data is basically off phone for some additional checks that are done. So you can't, let's be realistic, you can't do 100% on the phone. The phone doesn't have enough information. It doesn't have enough data points to be able to know exactly what to always check. So there are bits of information that are checked, but only minimum. And as I said, it's never at rest anyway. So we use a number of other services, as well as some of the stuff that we've developed, or a lot of the stuff that we've developed ourselves. So how do those institutions know? We are, when we work with them, we do often go through that due diligence process where they go through and ask us all of that information about how we do it and what we use and all of that. So one of the things you've probably noticed, we call it verifiable credentials. We don't call it verified credentials, because what we're doing is we're providing you, the consumer of the information, with all of the information that we know for you to determine whether or not you trust that information. So in the end, it's still up to the consumer of the information to decide if they trust it. And Jumio and OnFido, all that, they actually all do the same thing.
Yes.
If you go through their terms and conditions, they're not saying that you are who you say you are. They're saying this is what we've checked, and it's now up to you to make a decision whether or not you trust that.
Yep. Which still leads there to need to be sort of many points of compliance, right? So like every institution essentially has to do their own compliance.
Yeah. And I guess the other aspect is one thing that we are designing at the moment is this strength of identity. So it's not just the number of documents you've got; it's the number of places you've used it as well. So your identity can become more and more like a lot stronger.
Yeah.
Just because of the fact that you've used it, so that you've got this trust that actually grows with the age of your identity.
That's really interesting. So you've got these hackathons coming up. When are the hackathons happening?
So we're still planning the first one at the moment. It's very likely to be in Vietnam. We just finished building out a new office in Vietnam. The staff have moved in last week. So what we want to do as a bit of a celebration for that is we'll probably run a hackathon from the office there. So we're just looking for, at the moment, we're looking for some partners to do it with us, probably some of the local universities. We've just finished all of the work around the client libraries and documentation and all that sort of stuff to allow them to do it. So now it's sort of over to ops and marketing to work the rest out. But I'll be over there next week to film the new office, and I'll do a bit of a live stream as well as part of that.
Awesome.
But yeah, I mean, it'll be, if not this side of Christmas, it'll be shortly after the new year.
Cool. Well, so it's been such a pleasure having you on, Tim. If people want to find out more about ShareRing, where should they go and how should they get involved?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, Twitter's a great one. So if you just go to @ShareRingGlobal, or you can go to my Twitter, The Real Tim Boss.
@TheRealTimBoss.
Or our website is sharing.network, so ShareRing.network. And you'll get all the information.
Yeah, just anyone who wants to do that, be aware it is not spelled the same as the word sharing. It is share.
Yes.
Ring. So it has an E in it.
It's like the ring of people sharing.
A ring of people sharing. It's a ring of share. So if you want to find if you want to find the Twitter or the website, make sure that you put the E in the middle. We'll also put the links in our show notes. Tim, such a great pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Piers. It's been a great time. Thanks very much.
Utility, then you better call on these guys. I'm going radical, I'm going Radix, I'm going radical, I'm going Radix. Hyperspeed DeFi, never on a decline. Building the future, I feel like a savage.